Hello, everyone. Tonight I want to share with you some of the most terrifying and scariest experiences I've ever had. These are stories that have haunted me for years, and I hope you're ready to feel the same chills that I did. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let me take you on a journey through some of the darkest moments of my life. Story 1. The Whispering House. It was a cold, rainy night when I first stepped into the old house I had just inherited from my great-aunt. The place had been abandoned for years, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt an eerie presence. The air was thick with dust and a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake off. I tried to brush it aside, thinking it was just the atmosphere of an old, neglected house. The first few days were relatively uneventful. I spent my time cleaning and sorting through my great-aunt's belongings, but then the whispers started. It was subtle at first, like the rustling of leaves or distant murmurs, but as the days went by, the whispers became more distinct and unsettling. They always started around midnight, growing louder and more insistent. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a whisper right next to my ear. "Leave," it said. My heart pounded, and I jumped out of bed, turning on every light in the house. I searched every room, but there was no one there. The whispers continued night after night, and I found myself dreading the arrival of midnight. Desperate for answers, I decided to investigate the history of the house. I discovered that my great-aunt had been a recluse, living alone for many years. Neighbors mentioned strange noises and odd occurrences, but no one had ever dared to investigate further. The whispers were relentless, and I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed my things and left, never looking back. To this day, I still hear those whispers in my nightmares. Story 2. The Shadow in the Basement. When I moved into my first apartment, I was thrilled. It was small and cheap, but it was mine. However, my excitement quickly turned to dread when I discovered the basement. The landlord had warned me that the basement was off limits due to safety concerns, but I couldn't resist exploring. The basement was dark and damp, with a single light bulb that flickered ominously. As I descended the creaky stairs, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, and I could hear my own breathing echoing off the walls. That's when I saw it. A shadowy figure lurking in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but every time I went down to the basement, the shadow was there, always in the same spot. It never moved when I looked directly at it, but I could feel it watching me. I tried to avoid the basement as much as possible, but every time I had to go down there, I felt its cold, dark presence, and it terrified me. One night, I decided to confront my fears. Armed with a flashlight, I ventured into the basement, determined to find out what was haunting me. As I approached the shadow, the temperature dropped, and the light from my flashlight began to flicker. The shadow seemed to grow larger, enveloping me in darkness. I could hear whispers, similar to those I had heard in my great-aunt's house, but these were more sinister, filled with malice. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight, and ran up the stairs as fast as I could. I never went back to that basement again. Eventually, I moved out of the apartment, but the memory of that shadow still haunts me. Story 3. The Haunted Hotel Room. I was on a business trip and had to spend the night in a hotel. It was a quaint, old-fashioned place, and I was looking forward to a good night's sleep. Everything seemed normal until I went to bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of someone crying. The sound was faint at first, but it gradually grew louder and more desperate. I turned on the light, but the room was empty. The crying continued, coming from the direction of the closet. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the closet door, but there was no one there. The crying stopped as suddenly as it started, and an eerie silence filled the room. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to the hotel staff. They exchanged uneasy glances and reluctantly told me that the room had a history of guests reporting strange sounds and sightings. According to local legend, a woman had taken her own life in that room many years ago, and her spirit was said to haunt the place. Despite their reassurances that the room was perfectly safe, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over me. That night, I heard the crying again, but this time it was accompanied by the sound of soft footsteps. The footsteps seemed to circle my bed, growing closer and closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for morning to come. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was bathed in the soft light of dawn, and the crying had stopped. I checked out of the hotel that day, but the memory of those cries and footsteps still sends shivers down my spine. Story 4. The Ghostly Passenger. I used to drive late at night for a living, and one night I picked up a passenger who was standing at the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. He was an older man, dressed in outdated clothes, and he seemed quiet and reserved. I asked him where he was headed, and he gave me an address that was about an hour away. The drive was uneventful at first, but as we got closer to the destination, I started to feel uneasy. The man hadn't spoken a word since he got in, and there was something off about his presence. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, and for a brief moment I thought I saw him staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. When we arrived at the address, I turned to tell him we were there, but the back seat was empty. I swear I'd seen him get in, and the seatbelt was still fastened. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I checked the car, but there was no sign of the man. Confused and shaken, I decided to ask the residents of the house if they knew the man. An elderly woman answered the door, and when I described the passenger to her, she turned pale. She told me that the man I had described was her husband, who had died several years ago in a car accident on that very road. I drove away as quickly as I could, my mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. To this day, I still don't know if what I experienced was real or just a figment of my imagination, but the encounter left me deeply unsettled. Story 5. The Disappearing Friend. One summer, my friends and I went camping in a remote forest. We were excited to spend a few days away from the hustle and bustle of city life, enjoying nature and each other's company. The first couple of days were perfect, hiking, fishing, and sitting around the campfire telling stories. On the third night, we heard footsteps around our tent. We assumed it was one of us, but when we did a head count, everyone was accounted for. The footsteps continued, circling our campsite, and we grew increasingly uneasy. We decided to take turns keeping watch, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In the morning, we realized one of our friends was missing. We searched the surrounding area, calling out his name, but there was no response. We reported his disappearance to the authorities, and they conducted a thorough search, but no trace of him was found. Weeks turned into months, and still there was no sign of our friend. One night, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, all I could hear was static. But then I recognized my friend's voice. He sounded distant and frightened, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. The call ended abruptly, and I was left with more questions than answers. My friend's disappearance remains a mystery, and the forest where we camped has an eerie reputation. Some say it's haunted, and I can't help but wonder if something sinister took my friend that night. Story 6. The Cursed Mirror. I bought an antique mirror at a garage sale because I thought it looked cool. It had an ornate frame and a slightly tarnished surface that gave it a vintage charm. I hung it in my bedroom thinking it would add a touch of elegance to the decor. But strange things started happening as soon as I brought it home. I would see reflections that didn't match reality. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of shadowy figures standing behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. Other times, my own reflection would seem distorted with a sinister grin or hollow sunken eyes. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw a figure in the mirror. It was a tall, dark silhouette with glowing red eyes. I froze in terror, unable to move. The figure reached out towards me and I felt a cold, icy grip on my shoulder. I screamed and backed away, but the figure remained in the mirror watching me. I couldn't take it anymore and decided to get rid of the mirror. I took it to a local antique dealer, but he refused to buy it, saying it was cursed. Desperate to be rid of it, I left the mirror in a dumpster and drove away. But even now, I can't escape the memory of those twisted reflections and the feeling of being watched. When I was a child, I used to see a figure standing outside my bedroom window at night. It was just a silhouette, but it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I would hide under my covers, praying it would go away. One night I got the courage to peek out from under the covers, and the figure was still there, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. I screamed and my parents rushed in, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. They reassured me that it was just my imagination, but I knew what I had seen. The figure appeared night after night, always standing in the same spot. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but the fear was too intense. One morning I found footprints in the dirt outside my window. They led to a nearby forest and disappeared among the trees. No one believed me, but I knew it was real. Years later, I heard rumors about a missing person who had disappeared in that forest. Some said their spirits still roamed the area, searching for a way back home. I can't help but wonder if the figure at my window was connected to that tragedy. My grandparents' house had an attic that was always locked. They never spoke about it, and I was forbidden from going up there. But one summer, curiosity got the better of me, and I found the key hidden in a drawer. The attic was dusty and filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. As I was looking around, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, but no one was there. The air grew cold, and I felt an icy hand on my shoulder. I froze, unable to move as the temperature continued to drop. I heard whispers, faint and indistinct, but growing louder with each passing second. The room seemed to close in around me, and I felt a suffocating pressure on my chest. I stumbled backward, dropping the key, and ran out of the attic as fast as I could. I never went back up there, and my grandparents never mentioned the attic again. But the memory of that cold, oppressive presence still haunts me. I often wonder what secrets were hidden up there and why my grandparents were so adamant about keeping it locked. For a while, I kept getting phone calls late at night. When I answered, there was only silence on the other end. This went on for weeks, and I started to feel uneasy every time the phone rang. One night, I finally heard something other than silence, breathing. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone was listening to my every move. I hung up, but the calls continued. Each night, the breathing grew more labored and sinister, as if the caller was struggling to stay alive. I reported it to the police, but they couldn't trace the number. They suggested it was just a prank, but I knew it was something more. One night, I decided to stay on the line and confront the caller. I demanded to know who they were and what they wanted. The breathing stopped, and there was a long pause. Then a voice whispered my name. It was a voice I recognized, my own. I dropped the phone in terror and ran out of the house. The calls stopped after that, but I still get chills whenever my phone rings late at night. One night I woke up to find someone standing at the foot of my bed. It was a dark, shadowy figure, and I couldn't move or scream. It just stood there watching me. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread and helplessness. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, but the figure remained, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. I could hear a faint whispering, like the sound of many voices speaking in unison. The figure seemed to lean closer, and I felt a cold breath on my face. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually the figure faded away, and I was able to move again. I was paralyzed with fear and couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I never saw the figure again, but I always sleep with a light on now, just in case.